6.3 Apportioning indirect costs. Indirect costs are the black hole in conventional management information systems. Brian Plowman. It is important to remember that accounting information for management is not regulated by any laws or accounting standards. Managers can decide to use whatever accounting approach they wish to help them understand key cost relationships in their firm. However, for external financial reporting, managers and firms do need to conform to certain rules and accounting standards. This can involve being required to use certain approaches to measure, allocate, and apportion costs. Often, although certainly not always, the same approach required for external reporting will be used for internal management accounts in a firm. This saves the extra cost and complication of having two sets of accounts prepared on different bases for external and internal parties. As we have seen, the allocation of direct costs to a cost object is generally straightforward. However, the apportionment of indirect costs to a cost object is more difficult and requires many judgments and assumptions. How we apportion indirect costs can have many practical effects in a business. My first full-time job was working in the Sydney office of a UK-based investment bank, Schroders. I started out as an executive in Schroders' mergers and acquisitions team, advising senior executives of companies on both public and private company acquisitions and divestments. The Sydney office of Schroders had several divisions, including mergers and acquisitions, corporate lending, trading, foreign exchange and money market, funds management, and property management. There were various costs that related to Schroders in Australia as a whole, such as costs relating to the managing director, the human resources team, the board of directors, electricity, rent on meeting rooms and shared areas, receptionists, and the company Christmas function. These indirect costs were substantial and were generally apportioned to each division based on the number of full-time staff. This was great for the mergers and acquisitions team. We had a small number of highly paid staff. Other areas had much larger numbers of lower paid staff. This helped the mergers and acquisitions division to be highly profitable, and as our bonuses were directly related to the profitability of our division, this was all good for us. The heads of the other divisions could see it differently about how indirect costs should be allocated, and each year there could be heated discussions about the allocation of indirect costs within the bank. To be able to use accounting information on costs to gain insights into the realities of a firm, we need to clearly understand the judgments and assumptions embedded in the allocation of indirect costs. In this section, we will look at some key terms we will use and what they mean. We will then look at the major approaches used to apportion indirect costs to cost objects. Operating and support departments. We have seen how there are several production processes to make chocolate at the Cadbury factory at Claremont in Tasmania. Mixing, refining, conching, tempering, moulding, and wrapping. Each of these production processes could be carried out by separate groups of people in different operating departments. However, there are other groups of people doing other things in the factory. There is the maintenance team going around servicing and repairing machinery throughout the factory. There is the design and quality control team in an office above the factory whose jobs are to make minor changes to the design of different chocolate products and to test the chocolates being produced to ensure they are of high quality. Groups such as these do not actually make chocolate. They are not operating departments contributing to the various stages in producing chocolate. They provide support to the operating teams. They are support teams or departments. Indirect costs being incurred in the Cadbury factory in Claremont, such as electricity, council rates, and building maintenance, are connected to the activities of everyone in the factory, whether they are in operating departments or support departments. The indirect costs need to be apportioned to support departments and operating departments in the Cadbury chocolate factory. Then all the costs of support departments, their direct and indirect costs, need to be apportioned to the various operating departments. Each of the operating departments will have apportioned to them not only their share of the indirect costs, but also their share of all the costs of the support departments. Sitting on the fridge doors of each of the operating departments are their own direct costs, as well as the overhead costs, including support department costs, that have been apportioned to them. At this point, we now have all the direct and indirect costs incurred in Cadbury's chocolate factory in Claremont attached to the operating departments. We have a measure of the total costs of each of the mixing, refining, conching, tempering, moulding, and wrapping production processes in the factory. The final step is for these costs attached to the operating departments to be absorbed into the products as they pass through each stage of the production process. The products are much like a sponge wiping over a kitchen bench and absorbing water lying on the bench. This water on the kitchen bench is the costs we have attached to operating departments. The overall approach to getting indirect costs attached to the fridge doors of our products is set out in Figure 6.2 below. Figure 6.2, Path of Indirect Costs to Products. A crucial step in this process is how operating departments have various indirect costs apportioned to them. How do we know how much of a firm's indirect costs to apportion to each operating department, such as tempering, conching, or refining? We will now look at functional-based and activity-based costing systems, two approaches we can use to apportioning indirect costs to our products. Functional-based costing systems. A functional-based costing system apportions indirect costs based on an assumed or estimated functional relationship between the costs and how they are incurred in various operating and support departments. These can be called cost centres, being the fridge doors onto which costs are attached. For example, in the Cadbury chocolate factory at Claremont in Tasmania, council rates for the factory may be apportioned to operating and support departments based on the floor area occupied by each process, and the costs of operating the staff canteen at the factory may be apportioned based on the number of staff. This assumes the level of council rates is related to or caused by the amount of floor area occupied, and the costs of the canteen by the number of staff. The total costs of support departments may be apportioned to operating departments based on an assumed or estimated functional relationship between the support departments and the operating departments. For example, the total costs of the maintenance department may be apportioned to each of the operating departments based on machine hours used in each operating department. This assumes the amount of maintenance required is related to or caused by the number of hours the machines operate. These various functional relationships will be approximations of the actual relationship. For example, reorganizing an operating department so it uses less floor space will not in itself change the amount of council rates Cadbury pays on its Claremont factory. And reducing the number of staff in an operating department may reduce the amount of food consumed in a staff canteen, but may not change any of the other costs of the canteen. Once all indirect costs, including support department costs, have been apportioned to the operating departments, these indirect costs may in turn be absorbed into products based on an estimated functional relationship between the products and operating departments as the products pass through each operating department. The absorption rate would be calculated as total indirect costs of an operating department divided by the level of activity. In the Cadbury factory, many different products pass through the operating departments, including chocolate bars such as Twirl, Flake, Time Out, and Cherry Ripe. Boxed chocolates such as Favourites, Milk Tray, and Roses. And blocks of chocolate such as Caramello, Dairy Milk, Dream, and Hazelnut. If all these products are essentially the same in terms of how they pass through each stage of the production process, a suitable measure of level of activity is likely to be a volume measure, such as kilograms of chocolate being worked on each stage of production. However, some types of products may require different treatment in different operating departments. For example, some higher quality types of chocolate products may require more time spent in refining or conching than lower quality types of chocolate products. If that were the case, instead of a volume measure such as kilograms of chocolate, a better measure may be number of machine hours used in these stages of production. In a functional-based cost management system, common activity measures used to absorb indirect costs into products include machine hours, direct material costs, direct labour hours, and direct labour costs. Predetermined absorption rates. The absorption rates are based on the relationship between the total indirect costs of an operating department and a measure of the level of activity. If the total indirect costs of the refining department in the Cadbury chocolate factory were $2 million each year, and the activity measure used was kilograms of chocolate produced, and 100 million kilograms of chocolate were produced each year, then the absorption rate would be $2 million divided by 100 million kilograms, which equals 2 cents per kilogram of chocolate produced. We will want to apply this absorption rate throughout the year, perhaps weekly or monthly, to help us calculate the cost of our products frequently throughout the year. In Chapter 5, we saw the importance of short time lags for managers between the time something happens in a business and when managers find out about it. Managers cannot usually wait until actual indirect costs are calculated before absorbing them and calculating product costs. This is because it can often take some time for actual indirect costs to be known. For example, indirect costs such as electricity are usually not billed and paid for until a month or two after the electricity has been used. Also, some indirect costs are seasonal, such as electricity used in heating during winter, and we usually want to smooth these seasonal variations throughout the year rather than have product costs vary on a seasonal basis. In such cases, it can take a year before we know these costs for a full year and know how much we need to absorb into products throughout the year. In practice, we need to determine an absorption rate for each of our operating departments at the beginning of the year and then apply it throughout the year. At the beginning of the year, both the total indirect costs of each operating department and the level of activity will be estimates. What the actual indirect costs are and what the actual levels of activity are in the year is not known at the beginning of the year because they have not yet happened. Product costs are often determined throughout the year based on actual costs for direct costs and a predetermined absorption rate for indirect costs. However, after the end of the year, the actual indirect costs of production and the actual production volumes are known. These are likely to be different to the estimates used in calculating absorption rates for indirect costs. The differences between total indirect costs absorbed into our products and actual indirect costs incurred during a period is treated as a period cost and directly charged to income in that period and not absorbed into the cost of our products. If the amount of under or over absorbed indirect costs is a large figure, this can distort our product costs. For this reason, carefully estimating predetermined absorption rates is important for managers in a business. Activity-based costing systems. Activity-based costing, ABC, systems are an attempt to connect indirect costs more accurately to products, compared to functional-based costing systems, which we have seen use a presumed functional relationship between cost centres and products. ABC systems identify the activities, what is being done in a firm, that are driving or using up indirect costs. The costs of these activities are identified, and then the cost of each activity is attached to each product to the extent the product uses that activity. Absorption and variable costing. Two commonly used methods to attach costs to products, or to other cost objects for that matter, are absorption costing and variable costing. Absorption costing, also called full costing, involves attaching both direct and indirect costs to each product. Variable costing attaches only variable costs to products. Variable costs vary with changes in the level of activity, usually sales or production. They increase if more of a product is sold or produced, and reduce if less of a product is sold or produced. Variable costs are usually direct costs, for example, the cost of milk or butter or cocoa in making chocolate. The more chocolate we make, the more milk, butter and cocoa we need to use, so the cost of purchasing these items will increase. They can usually be easily allocated to products as they are clearly linked to or driven by the sales or production of a product. When reporting to parties external to a firm, accounting standards require firms to use absorption costing or full costing. However, firms can use either absorption costing or variable costing for purposes internal to a firm. Managers could choose to attach production costs as well as other costs such as administration, selling and distribution costs to the cost of its products. However, it is usual to only allocate production costs. For example, selling costs may have been incurred by Ryman Healthcare in seeking to sell off-the-plan retirement village units before they are completed or even started to be built. These costs typically would not be attached to Ryman Healthcare's valuation of its retirement village units. These selling costs would be treated as costs incurred during the period. In this section, we have seen the key distinction between direct and indirect costs and the importance of understanding how indirect costs are absorbed or included into product costs. But business never stands still. Things are always changing. We will now look at the importance for managers to deeply understand how costs change as sales or production varies. 6.4. How costs change. What matters is not methods or techniques, but a sensitivity to problems and a consuming passion for them, or as the Greeks said, the gift of wonder. Karl Popper. In business, opportunities come up all the time. Some may be worth pursuing, others might be better left alone. Managers need to choose which business opportunities to pursue and which to leave alone. To do this, they need to consider expected future costs and revenues for these different opportunities. These expected future costs and benefits will be based on forecasts of sales and production if it is a manufacturing enterprise. Of course, it is difficult to predict the future. What if our forecasts of sales or production are proved wrong? To understand the impact of this, we need to understand how costs and revenue may change at different levels of sales or production. This section looks at how costs behave or change as sales or production vary. One key idea is that some costs in a business can be fixed, that is, not change with changes in sales or production levels, and other costs can be variable, that is, they do change with changes in sales or production levels. Fixed and variable costs. My eldest son started playing gigs in rock bands around Wellington from the age of 16. His first band was called the Henderson Experience, and it gained quite a following amongst teenagers in Wellington. His first gig was at Thistle Hall, which was a hall run by Wellington City Council at the then run-down end of Cuba Street in Wellington. A motorway has since been built right next to Thistle Hall, and the general area has now been greatly tidied up and changed quite a bit. I helped organise his first gig, putting up security for the bond and organising some bouncers. Other parents of band members helped with sound equipment, lights and so on. It was an alcohol-free, under-18 venue, and people attending came and went through the night. Many were clearly accessing alcohol from somewhere, although everyone was well under the legal drinking age. We closed around 11:30 p.m. and left numbers of people congregating out in the street. One of the things I taught my son was the difference between fixed and variable costs, and the importance of understanding the break-even point for his gigs. He's a very capable musician, so hey, it was one of the few areas I could help him with. Putting on gigs involved some fixed costs. These were costs that he would have to pay regardless of how many people turned up on the night and bought tickets. It cost about $100 to hire the hall. He paid the bouncers $50 for the night. He produced some posters for $20, and the sound and lighting equipment was loaned by one of the parents of a band member for free. So the fixed costs for the night were hall hire, $100, bouncers, $50, posters, $20, total fixed costs, $170. There was a $5 entry charge per person. The number of people he would need to buy a ticket for the night to break even was 34 people. That is, $170 divided by $5 equals 34. On that first gig, he had 95 people buy tickets. The revenue was $475, 95 times $5, and the total costs were $170, so the profit was $305. He did a few gigs at Thistle Hall, but the fire rating for the hall was 99 people, and the gig started to attract 135 to 150 people. So that was the end of that venue for the Henderson Experience. My son then negotiated with some of the bars in Wellington to play under 18 only gigs on occasional Sunday nights in the school holidays, or when there was a public holiday on the Monday. No alcohol was sold at the bar, just soft drinks during the gigs, and there was a cover charge of $5 per head. One venue was at Indigo, now called San Fran, at the better end of Cuba Street in Wellington. The deal my son struck with them was that he would pay them $100 for the venue, plus $50 for the sound engineer, plus $2 per ticket sold. He also had a cost of about $20 for posters. In this case, his fixed costs were venue hire, $100, sound engineer, $50, posters, $20, total fixed costs, $170. His variable costs were $2 per person. The ticket prices were $5, so this left him with $3 per ticket to cover the fixed costs and then contribute to any profit on the night. The number of tickets he would need to sell to break even and cover his fixed costs was $170 divided by $3, which equals 56.67, say 57 tickets. At the gig at Indigo, my son's band was able to get 200 people to come, so total revenue was 200 times $5, which equals $1,000. Total revenue, 200 times $5, $1,000. Less variable costs, 200 times $2, which equals $400. So $1,000 less $100 is $600. Less fixed costs, $170, gives profit of $430. Firms tend to be a lot more complicated than my son organising individual gigs in bars in Wellington, or even tours he later organised around New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Europe and US, involving multiple gigs, travel, accommodation and food costs. However, the idea that we can divide our costs into fixed or variable costs is a very useful one for managers. Fixed costs remain constant over different activity levels, and variable costs vary with activity and vary in a straight line, or in other words, variable costs remain constant per unit of output, such as Indigo's $2 per ticket cost. This idea of fixed and variable costs does not include any efficiency or productivity changes that might occur with different levels of activity. It also assumes changes in costs can be understood sufficiently by just one factor, such as the level of sales or production. This may be fine with situations like my son's rock gigs, but firms are far more complex. In larger firms, statistical techniques can be used to look at the past relationships of various costs to different activity levels in the business to better understand what factors are driving a firm's costs. The key for managers is to deeply understand the relationships of level of costs to activity in their firm and to understand why these relationships exist. In other words, to understand what is going on within their firms in terms of costs and activity levels. For those studying the Bachelor of Accounting, we will look at this further in ACT 19060 Management Accounting. Managers are constantly seeking to make choices in the face of various opportunities before them. For example, my son faced questions of whether to change the selling price of tickets and how this might impact on the profitability of gigs. How many tickets needed to be sold to break even? Always a crucial concern for him as he could not afford to run gigs at a loss. How many tickets needed to be sold to make a specific level of profit, and how much should he spend on advertising? For example, should he promote gigs on radio, and how much should he spend on posters? Managers of firms want to make similar decisions or calls for their firms. These decisions are future-oriented, so we need to estimate future costs. Cost, volume, profit analysis. There are no facts, only interpretations. Friedrich Nietzsche. Through and through, the world is infested with quantity. To talk sense is to talk quantities. It is no use saying the nation is large. How large? It is no use saying radium is scarce. How scarce? You cannot evade quantity. You may fly to poetry and music, and quantity and number will face you in your rhythms and octaves. J.R. Newman. Yes, there are numbers in accounting. We've seen that management accounting is about helping managers better understand what is really going on in their firms. An important part of doing this is to deeply understand the relationships between costs and level of activity in a firm. Costs arise in a firm because of a firm doing things. Whenever a firm does anything, it seems to incur costs. Costs are driven by or related to levels of activity in a firm. We can express these relationships in terms of numbers, or in other words, in terms of mathematical formulas and equations. For example, one cost of my son's gigs at Indigo was the need to pay the owner of the bar $2 per ticket sold. An equation that describes this relationship is y equals fx, where y equals the cost of the venue, x equals the number of tickets sold. This could be shown as a straight line on a graph as in figure 6.3 below. Figure 6.3, variable costs of a gig at Indigo. There are a range of costs that typically vary with the level of production in a factory. For example, in Cadbury's chocolate factory at Claremont, this might be direct materials, milk, butter and cocoa, which would vary with changes in the level of activity or production. However, variable costs rarely behave in a simple straight line relationship with the level of activity. For example, for his second gig at Indigo, my son negotiated the $2 per ticket paid to Indigo be reduced to $1 per ticket after 150 tickets had been sold. For his second gig at Indigo, the variable costs could be shown in the graph in Figure 6.4 below. Figure 6.4, variable costs of a second gig at Indigo. For his first gig at Indigo, there was a fixed amount of $100 that my son needed to pay Indigo regardless of how many tickets were sold. Along with $50 for a sound engineer and $20 for posters, this meant fixed costs were $170. This could be shown on a graph in Figure 6.5 below. Figure 6.5, fixed costs of first gig at Indigo. The total cost of the venue for the first gig at Indigo by the Henderson Experience was $170 plus $2 times the number of tickets sold. This can be expressed as a mathematical equation. Y equals A plus BX, which equals $170 plus $2 times X, where Y equals the total cost of the venue and X equals the number of tickets sold. This can be shown graphically in Figure 6.6 below. Figure 6.6, total costs of first gig at Indigo. This cost function, Y equals $170 plus $2 times X, can be used to calculate the total cost of the venue for each level of number of tickets sold. If 100 tickets are sold, the total cost is $370. $170 plus $2 times $100. And if 150 tickets are sold, the total cost is $470. $170 plus $2 times 150. Since we know the sales revenue for each level of number of tickets sold, as the tickets are $5 each, we can calculate the profit for each level of number of tickets sold. What is the point of doing this? Well, it helps us understand the risks we are taking in our business. We know that business is forward-looking. We are looking at what might happen in the future, but we do not know the future for sure. When my son was organising a gig, he did not know how many people would turn up on the night. Neither does the owner of the Indigo Bar. No one knows this critical piece of information in advance. The first time my son ran a gig at Indigo, about 200 people came. Indigo can take up to about 300 people. The owner of Indigo received $500, a fixed amount of $100 and $2 per ticket sold. That is $100 plus $2 times 200. Also, they made some profit on sales of soft drinks at the bar. My son could see the owner of Indigo was pleased. The gig was on early and the bar was free later in the evening for the usual over 18 crowd. The bar owner had taken in $500 plus profits on soft drinks he would not have had otherwise. For the next gig at Indigo, my son found he could negotiate a flat $2 per ticket charge for the first 150 tickets sold and $1 for additional tickets, with no $100 fixed charge. Why do you think the owner of Indigo was willing to do this for the second gig? It is about risk. A key aspect of risk in any firm's operations is the break-even point, the level of activity where revenue equals costs. When you break even, you make no profit and you make no loss. At levels of activity below the break-even point, you lose money. Not a good outcome. and at levels of activity above the break-even point, you make money, a good outcome. If in business you prefer to make money compared to losing money, then you better have a good understanding of where the break-even points are in the various aspects of your business. So where is the break-even point for my son's gigs at Indigo? At his first gig at Indigo, we can graph both his band's sales revenue and costs for each level of activity, ticket sales, as shown in figure 6.7 below. Figure 6.7, break-even analysis of first gig at Indigo. The break-even point is where sales equals costs. When 56.67, say 57 tickets, are sold, the break-even on the gig was sales equals costs equals $285. If less than 57 tickets are sold, my son's band would make a loss. If more than 57 tickets are sold, my son's band would make a profit. For his second gig at Indigo, the break-even analysis is shown in figure 6.8 below. Figure 6.8, break-even analysis of a second gig at Indigo. The break-even point is now at 24 tickets. With fixed costs of $70, costs of sound engineer and posters, my son's band starts to make a profit once 24 tickets are sold. For the second gig, the owner of Indigo is bearing much more of the risk of poor ticket sales rather than my son's band. For the 4 teenagers in the band for whom making a loss on a gig of a few $100s would be a big deal, the risks in the second gig are a lot less than the risks they took on the first gig. Once the band had demonstrated they could bring in a good crowd, the owner of Indigo was prepared to take much more of the risk on ticket sales and not seek to pass this on to the band. The relationship between fixed and variable costs is a key driver of the operational risks of a business. For example, airlines have high fixed costs, such as the cost of planes, and low variable costs, such as the cost of ticketing and the cost of a cup of tea on a domestic flight. What does this mean for an airline's level of operational risk? Well, it is very high. If the airline has an empty row or two of seats at the back of a plane, it may make a loss on that flight. If it fills those back few rows, it makes a profit. Its break-even point for each flight is at a rather high level of ticket sales. The airline business has a high level of operational risk. I generally hate capital-intensive businesses with high levels of operational risk because they are, well, risky. The first gig at Indigo involved the band taking a higher level of operational risk than the second gig. As with running bands, so it is with running businesses. It is important to know where the break-even points are in any business. Another important idea is the concept of contribution margin. Contribution margin is the amount each dollar of sales contributes to covering a firm's fixed costs and contributing to profits. Contribution margin per unit of activity is contribution margin equals sales less variable costs. For both gigs at Indigo, the contribution margin for the first 150 tickets sold was contribution margin equals $5 less $2, which equals $3. However, for the second gig at Indigo, for ticket sales more than 150 tickets, the contribution margin was contribution margin equals $5 minus $1, which equals $4. The contribution margin ratio is the contribution margin divided by sales revenue. For the first 150 tickets sold for the second gig at Indigo, the contribution margin ratio was $3 divided by $5, which equals 60%. For ticket sales over 150 tickets, the contribution margin ratio was $4 divided by $5, which equals 80%. The contribution margin ratio shows the proportion of each dollar of sales that is not being used up in variable costs. It is the amount available to cover fixed costs and contribute to profit. The bigger the contribution margin ratio, the more sensitive profits will be to the level of activity. A firm with genuine prospects to grow sales strongly will have greater potential for growth in profits if it has a high contribution margin ratio than if it has a low contribution margin ratio. However, if the firm's fixed costs were also high, then this greater potential for growth in profits would also come with significant downside risk. If sales should decline, there would be greater potential for significant losses. Caveats. When thinking about the relationship of costs, volumes of activity and profits, often called cost, volume, profit and CVP analysis, we make a range of assumptions about how costs and profits may vary with different levels of activity, usually sales or production. We can assume straight line relationships, which may not always hold in practice. And we can assume fixed costs stay unchanged with different levels of activity, although all costs will eventually vary with large changes in levels of activity. Yet managers need to understand how costs and profits can be expected to change in the future with changes in sales or production. Accounting numbers can play an important part in helping managers deeply understand these relationships, but they need to be handled with care and insight by managers. Conclusion. We have seen that managers need to keep track of costs in their firms, to keep costs from getting out of control, and to help plan the way forward for their firm. Accounting can help managers do this by attaching costs to cost objects, such as to products. We saw the difference between direct and indirect costs and the challenges many businesses face in apportioning indirect costs to products. We also saw the critical distinction between fixed and variable costs in a firm. A deep understanding of how a firm's costs and products can be expected to change with different levels of activity is a key to understanding a firm's level of operational risk. We saw the importance of managers having a clear understanding of the break-even points and contribution margins of various aspects of their firm's activities. Accounting can play a crucial role in helping managers understand the key cost relationships in a firm if a firm's accounting for costs reflects what is going on in a firm. Typically, managers will make decisions about a firm based on how a firm accounts for its costs because it represents the best information available to them. To the extent a firm's accounting for costs reflects the economic and business realities of a firm, it can help managers connect to this reality. To the extent it does not, perhaps because they have been adjusted to tell stories people in a firm may wish to tell and which do not reflect what is really going on in a firm, then the management accounts can hinder managers from connecting to a firm's reality. Managers are behind the wheel and driving their firms. If they do not have a strong grasp on the reality of the cost relationships in their firms, they are likely to drive in directions where it may not be good for them to go. In the next chapter, we will look at the short term, at the immediate steps for action that lie before any business. Business activity happens in the short term, in the immediacy of the moment, as we take the next steps forward each day. We will see how accounting can help or hinder managers plan the next steps for a firm, communicate them clearly to those who will have to implement them, as well as ensure people do implement them, while also responding quickly to the various surprises in business which invariably occur.